ballot for congressional redistricting. And if they're, well, then you're way ahead of me. But if anybody wants to get involved or wants to sign out some petitions, just see me after the forum. The second thing, we have a bunch of forums coming up, and they're all out on the table. But come to the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland website if you want to know more about what forums we have coming up. Thirdly, I want to thank our co-sponsors tonight. They are Case Western Reserve Siegel Lifelong Learning, the Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com, the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, the Urban Community School, and our corporate sponsor is First Interstate. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator this evening. Ginger Christ writes about healthcare for the Plain Dealer and has been a reporter in Ohio for the past decade. During that time, she's covered transportation, manufacturing, real estate, and business news for local newspapers and national magazines. Ginger has worked at the Plain Dealer for the past year and formerly was the newspaper's transportation reporter. In that role, she covered the public square bus debate, local and state transit funding shortfalls, and multimodal transportation. Ginger grew up in Northeast Ohio and moved back to the Cleveland area 5 years ago. Ginger Christ.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming and watching me struggle through this. To start, I'm going to introduce our panel, everyone who so graciously volunteered their time today. So we start here with Derek Bauman. He grew up in Warrensville Heights, where his family depended on public transit. His earliest memories are riding the Rapid into downtown with his dad. He spent 26 years as a police officer and now lives in downtown Cincinnati, where he's a candidate for city council. He is vice chair of All Aboard Ohio, a statewide transit advocacy organization, and chair of the Cincinnati NAACP Transportation Committee. Derek was involved in establishing the Cincinnati streetcar and led efforts to keep bus benches from being removed from bus stops in Cincinnati. He spoke out against Cleveland's closure of Public Square to buses and now is advocating for the return of Amtrak service to Cincinnati. Next, we have Grace Gallucci. She's the executive director of the Northeast Ohio Areawide Coordinating Agency, known as NOACA, which is the region's transportation and environmental planning agency and sets the transportation agenda for the area. Prior to her time at NOACA, Grace was the top finance executive for the Chicago Regional Transportation Authority. Before that, she directed budget and management for RTA here. Grace started her career in transportation as a budget and management analyst for the Office of Transportation in Broward County, Florida, and helped create Tri-Rail. Next, we have Hunter Morrison. He's a senior fellow in urban studies for Cleveland State and is a senior advisor to the Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium, which is a regional public-private partnership dedicated to making the region more vibrant, resilient, and sustainable. Hunter previously served as the consortium's executive director, during which time they developed the Vibrant Northeast Ohio 2040 Plan, which is a vision for the 12-county region that links economic development with things like transportation. And last but not least, we have Akshai Singh, who is an organizer for Clevelanders for Public Transit, which is a local riders organization that's been very vocal in advocating for transit throughout the city's public square debate and also RTA's service cuts. I know I spoke to them a lot on my last beat, and I'm sure you've read about them in the paper because you're all subscribers. He also organizes for Ohio for Transportation Equity, which is a coalition dedicated to increasing access to public transit in the state, and he's a coach with America Scores Cleveland and on the executive committee of the Ohio Sierra Club. So that introduces our panel. You guys know who I am. So now what we're talking about. Today we're going to talk about the role transportation plays in creating equity in communities, creating equitable communities. One of the things that I love most when I cover transportation was just the role that it plays in every aspect of life. You know, transportation, access to transportation determines what housing you can have, your access to healthcare, which is important to me now, and I'm trying to write about, the food that you're able to get, and you know, really it plays a role in so many ways, from jobs and everything else, economic development. So what we're looking at here is what Cleveland's doing right, what we're doing wrong, what maybe some other places have figured out, and what we can learn from them. So let's turn it over to the panel here. I'm going to start with Grace, sorry. And so what's been in the news recently was that you guys just released your long-term transportation plan. So that plan just came out. It covers transportation agenda for the area for the next 23 years. About $16 billion in spending is outlined in that. So I'm interested in finding out, in developing that plan, what role did equity play, and what role did, speaking to the least of us, have in developing that?
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here this evening, and I appreciate all the folks, including the League of Women Voters and the Plain Dealer and Urban Community School for putting the forum together. When we started working on the public outreach plan for the long-range transportation plan about 18 months ago, we really wanted to develop a plan that spoke to everyone and then was written about everyone. And as we started engaging the public, we looked to do it in two different ways. One was ensuring that we heard from people before we actually wrote the draft. Many times, public meetings are held after a draft document or a plan is already written, and then asking the public for comment. That's just not acceptable. We really wanted to hear from people as we were working on the document. We took the steps of looking at the existing system, looking at the impacts of various potential points, but then wanted to hear from the public. And from the very beginning, as we began that outreach plan, we said we needed to ensure that we heard from everyone and reached out to the public in many ways that perhaps had not been done before by us or by others in the transportation industry, particularly metropolitan planning organizations. And we sort of launched our transportation plan with a couple of different forums. One was with the Cleveland Foundation as they were working through their 100-year anniversary last year and spoke to the importance in transportation or of transportation in the region and invited a wide audience of hundreds of people to participate in that. And then the Old Stone Church was doing a transportation forum, I think it was called Hope in the City. And that also was an opportunity for us to reflect on what does transportation mean when we're speaking to an entire community, and how is equity a part of that? So we really strived, as we developed that plan, to be inclusive in both getting the feedback and developing a plan that was accessible to everyone. So looking at what does transportation do for individuals, and how do we ensure that everybody has access to that system and that the system works for everyone?
All right, thanks, Grace. So that said, I want to turn it over to Akshai, and I just want to know how you think that, Cleveland does in terms of equity, and what issues the people that you represent really have in accessing transportation or in using transportation to access those important parts of their lives.
Yeah, I want to echo Grace's thanks to our hosts for having us. In terms of having an equitable transit system, I think Cleveland has a long way to go. It's coming from a place that has always been challenging. When you think about our public transit system and how it was designed and who it was designed for, I happen to live in Cleveland Heights, and the history of the Van Swearingens in kind of designing public transportation and on the east side is not one about necessarily equity, but we get to still benefit from some of those decisions today. In terms of kind of our overall investment, we're certainly in a challenged place where our main funding source for public transportation, the county sales tax, has been diminished over the years by outmigration from Cuyahoga County to its surrounding areas, and one that's put an increasing strain on Cleveland's RTA. in terms of providing frequent enough service, in terms of being able to provide kind of the kind of coverage in terms of time of day for people to get to work for a second or third shift job, and for being able to provide an affordable fare. Cleveland, for a metro of its size, is the second least affordable transit in the country right now, second to Tampa. And I'm worried that next year's fare hike is gonna put us in a position that's closer to that kind of dubious honor. And so, right now we're really hoping to see a kind of put a floor under transit in Cleveland, because for people who are currently reliant on public transportation, we're seeing that service is kind of increasingly becoming untenable and unaffordable, and that's certainly a function of the state, but it's also a function of kind of the way that we determine local priorities as well, and I don't think we should forget that part.
Okay, something I wanted to ask Derek about was, I know that you were involved in helping the NAACP establish or pass a resolution making transit a civil right, or declaring transit a civil right. So I'm interested in what that means on a real level in the community, and if there have been any examples of that kind of resolution, coming off the paper and becoming more than, words or a catchphrase.
Sure. So first, I think it's important to recognize the background and the history, particularly with the history of the interstate highway system and the impacts and the disparate impacts that the build-out of the interstate highway system had, particularly on communities of color over history, dating from the 1950s on. So I'm originally from Cleveland, living now in Cincinnati, and kind of a student of the history there, and I can tell you that I-75 and its build-out through the urban core of Cincinnati decimated and destroyed a community called the West End that was 40 to 50,000 people, very dense and historic buildings, and these people were basically moved out en masse for the construction of I-75 in the 1960s. We see throughout the country today still the impacts of urban highways and how governments just magically, at least in the United States, magically come up with dollars for highway expansions and the automobile, basically, and the impacts that it has on communities, particularly which are low-income communities that don't have cars to begin with. So in the city of Cincinnati, we have over 20% of our households that don't own cars. We have a history of the interstate highway system disparately impacting these communities. And even today, we have just opened up a brand new highway interchange, the MLK interchange on I-71. We don't actually really know how much it's cost. It's always been a little bit mysterious, but somewhere in the 9 figures, $130 million. And it's created now with the interchanges, local street widenings and such, again, impacts on neighborhoods of color. Many of the folks who don't own cars, but suffer the impacts of the traffic, basically making it easier for commuters to get in and out of our hospital and university area and back to the suburbs, but they're left to deal with the pollution. They're left to deal with streets that are unsafe for pedestrians and people on bikes. And we see a $130 million transportation project that we could not even get as much as a bus stop out of. So what this resolution calls for is basically transportation or public transportation funding from the state level, among a few other things. And I did leave a copy. There's some out on the table, and I think some got passed around as well. This was just passed on this past July when the National NAACP had their conference in Cincinnati, and it was kind of shocking to me as a lifetime NAACP member and a public transportation advocate that the NAACP did not have a policy on this. And so we created one, and actually Ken Prendergast, our executive director of All Aboard Ohio, was in large measure responsible for the text of this. And then I was able to get it through our local branch and then passed by the national. So to answer your question specifically, there has not been, I don't think, a lot of outcome from this yet. It's only been in existence about 10 months. I'm not sure that it's up on the National's website yet, but I think it's a first step because I believe that public transportation is the civil rights issue of our time coming up. We have fought battles for education. We have fought battles for housing. We have fought battles for marriage equality and a number of other issues. And quite frankly, when we have, in the state of Ohio, 9% of the population that cannot or that does not own a car, in our major cities, over 20 to 30% of our households that do not have a car, we have to fund public transportation as a basic civil right so that people can lead their lives, so that people can get to work, get to the grocery store, and get to their doctor's appointments. And so that's what we're calling for. And so now the next step, I believe, in this is moving from advocacy to action. And that's part of the reason why I'm here in Cleveland today, because I think, especially in the state of Ohio, and hopefully this will be a further question with regard to state funding of public transportation, not only local funding, but that we need to come together across the state. And I know being from Cleveland and living in Cincinnati now, oftentimes sports rivalries and such keep us divided and just other things. But we need to come together on this and call for action. And we've done it and been impactful in other ways, but I believe public transportation is the next issue that we need to come together for the people.
I'm going to jump ahead to start talking about transportation funding here, but Hunter, I'm going to let you lead off on that, just to give you a heads up. When it comes to transportation funding in Ohio, it's a mess. It just is. I mean, all the stories I wrote, basically every story I wrote as transportation reporter was, in some way tied to either national funding issues or state funding issues, local funding issues. I mean, Ohio funds transit. It's like 1% of the state transportation budget. Ohio is one of the worst in the countries in terms of funding transit. So obviously, I mean, we're dealing with a lot here, and trying to solve these problems we're talking about without funds is difficult to do. So Hunter, do you mind speaking just kind of about what we do about transportation funding and how we kind of, move forward and, what the plan is?
Well, the simple answer is there is none. The state of Ohio, for an urbanized state, has no commitment to funding transit as either an equity issue or as an economic development issue. And as a result, the legacy transportation systems, which are in our legacy cities, Cincinnati and Toledo and Cleveland and Youngstown and Akron, have been struggling to maintain basic service. We have cities that were developed around transit, and the situation in Cleveland is replicated in all these other places. Our bus systems replicate and replace the trolley systems, the streetcar systems. The housing was built around those lines. If you look at the route structure across Northeast Ohio, where we've studied through NEOSC, Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium, all of the communities in 12 counties and all of the legacy cities, the basic route structure is still in place, but the level of service, to your point, has been severely curtailed so that frequent service, i.e. 15-minute headways, reliability throughout the working day and even into the evening is simply not there. The question of funding transit is often tangled up in the requirements or the provisions of the Ohio Constitution with regard to the use of transportation funds for roads. There are other ways around it. If there is a will, there is a way. We can, Councilman Johnson remembers the years when we would go down to Columbus to get special consideration for stadiums, rock halls, arenas, for the core city of the largest county in the state of Ohio, with the northern boundary of which happens to be a lake. Bingo. If there's a will, there's a way. The state legislature is dominated by suburban and rural interests. The cities are perceived to be filled with people who are poor and of color and undeserving. And therefore, and transit is usually defined as a social service for the poor and undeserving. That's a hard argument to make. One of the things we found when we had the opportunity, and Grace was our chair of the Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium. For 3 years, we went around all of Northeast Ohio, all 12 counties. We engaged about 6,000 people very intimately through polling, through meetings, through online polling, in what they want. We found across the region, and I'm not just speaking about Cuyahoga County, I'm speaking about Ashtabula County, I'm speaking about Wayne County, I'm speaking about Trumbull County, across the region, in areas that are largely Republican and largely or Democratic. People want more housing choices, and they want more transportation choices. They want to preserve our environment, and they want us to collaborate. Those are the 4 things that rang true across the region. And when we got done with this effort, the 12 counties, directly or through their MPOs and councils of governments, voted unanimously to adopt this as a framework. And I would say that as we look forward, the constituency for better transportation choices is very much broader than we believe. Why is that? Well, it's not just the poor and people of color stuck in the declining neighborhoods of central cities, the classic urban population as most people look at cities. It's aging baby boomers out in the suburbs who need to get to their doctor too and don't want to drive. It's the millennials who you want to attract to your core cities who don't want to own a car either because they can't afford to because of student loans, or it's a lifestyle choice, or some combination of both. It's also workers who can't get to work in Lake County. So the businesses in Lake County are talking with Lake Tran, or were when we talked to them, about the fact they can't get workers. Well, Lake Tran is a very good system to bring people in from Lake County to downtown Cleveland to work in downtown at the Federal Building. It is a very bad system because it's unidirectional to go the other way. So the businesses in Lake County are not competitive. We heard the same thing in Medina County, with businesses that are doing production work, that are looking for moderate paying job, or moderate paying work, or moderate skill workers who can't get there because of the wages they're being paid. They can't afford a car that's reliable to get to work in February. So they're uncompetitive. The argument that needs to be made is a much broader argument about equity and opportunity and efficiency, and understand that this is a region-wide issue. It's not city versus suburb. It's whether the engine of growth that's Northeast Ohio will be able to compete to its fullest extent by offering choices. Norm Krumholtz, my predecessor, used to talk about, and he still does, about more choices for people who have few. The basic equity argument of planning that Norm so eloquently phrased, and 2 generations or 3 generations of planners have memorized, along with Make No Little Plans that Burnham came up with. But today, the argument is not just more choices for people who have few, it's more choices for everybody. Because we're in an economy where people want choices, expect choices, demand choices, and one size does not fit all. And we see that in the polling about housing choices, and we see that in the polling about transportation choices. And Grace was able to, through the long-range planning process in 5 counties, to take that to an even finer grain and find many of the same things. So I think one of the things we need to do as those who care about transit and economic development and equity and ability to get to work is to frame the argument much more broadly than we've ever framed and say transit is not simply a social service. It is a social service for those who have few choices, for those who do not have cars, for those who are too old to drive or incapable or undesiring of driving. But it's also an economic development tool of untapped value. And Cuyahoga County, which has the best system in the region and one of the 20 best systems in the country, according to the Federal Reserve, has the bones to revive our downtown, our neighborhoods, and our first suburbs, all of which were built around transit. But it can't do that alone. It can't do that if its level of service is subpar and vestigial. And I live out in Youngstown, where we had a great system, and today it's subpar and vestigial because there's no money there either. This is an economic development argument that needs to be made to each and every candidate for governor who's wandering around the state wondering what they're going to offer. And I would suggest to you that making alliances across Northeast Ohio, across your 4 metropolitan planning organizations, across the 400 jurisdictions, and using the platform of Vibrant Neo, which polled extensively and very productively and very scientifically the voters in each and every county, to say there's people out there that want this. There are people who look like me, because they're about this age, who want to be in something other than a suburban house with 2 cars. I want to be in a smaller place. I want to be able to walk. And there's a whole baby boom market that's out there, both here and who would come back from where they left because the economy tanked. But there's a millennial market. And there are those who we work very hard through workforce development to get the skills to get the jobs, but forget that they have to be able to get to the job. It's not enough to train somebody. If they can't get to work reliably, they don't keep that job. So the system of job development needs to be inclusive. The system of where we put housing needs to be inclusive of the transportation equation. And this needs to be the next wave. This needs to be the next gateway. This needs to be the next Playhouse Square. This needs to be the next regional priority to put this community on the map nationally, so we're nationally competitive as a place that takes equity and opportunity seriously.
Thanks so much for that. That kind of leads into something that I think we should talk about, and I've talked about this with Grace and written about it. So the idea of creating a regional transit system, and I mean regional as in greater than just Cleveland, just, Cuyahoga County. Something that, ties in these outlying counties and brings in the support from them in order to support a stronger core here too. So I'm going to start opening this up. Whoever wants to talk to that, feel free to, and we'll just go through the panel.
Sure, I can start that discussion. Obviously, our transportation system, if we are going to encourage it to be about choice for everyone, if we're going to ensure that transportation is a civil right, we have to think about it in a broader sense than just Cleveland or just Cuyahoga County. We need to think about it regionally. There really are no boundaries to the road system. You can get on a road in New Hampshire and drive all the way to California without hitting a stoplight. And we have to think of public transit in a similar way, that it has to be able to connect everyone without the jurisdictional or other kinds of false boundaries. Now, that's the grand scheme. We can look at it in terms of a regional system, and that we currently have 5 systems if you count just the NOACA region. I think you probably have 6 or 7 if you count the Summit County and Portage County area too. And yet, none of those systems, other than through friendly agreement, really plan together. They don't necessarily strategize on how best to reach the folks that need to get to where they need to go. And quite frankly, from an efficiency perspective, things are not necessarily run in a way that would be leveraging the least amount of money for the most amount of benefit. And so a regional transit system, I think, from a financial perspective, would be helpful because we could look at the financing structure as well as the equity more broadly. We could then better compare it with the other modes like the highway system or the even walking and biking and kind of think about how to put all of that together. And so the question always becomes, how do you manage that? Administratively, who runs it? Administratively, who makes the decisions on the planned routes? Who makes the decisions on the capital assets? Who makes the decisions on who pays and who benefits? That's really what it comes down to. And I think it can be done regionally. When I worked in Chicago, that's exactly what we had. We had a 6-county transit system. And we had the Regional Transportation Authority, which is where I worked, and we were the parent corporation, if you will, for the 6 counties. We were the funding organization, the planning organization, and the oversight organization. And then there were 3 operating agencies, the CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority, which most people know as the L, or the urban bus system. We had Metra, which is the commuter rail system, which then served all 6 of the counties. And then we had the suburban bus system, PACE, which served essentially predominantly the 5 outlining counties, but of course serving Cook County and downtown Chicago, as does the system that is the commuter rail. It's not that that was a magic system. It was a system that the community, the region, looked to develop in order to ensure that the region grew both equitably as well as ensuring that they were competitive nationally and regionally. And they created that system in 1974, about the same time most regional systems were developed. We developed a system here in Northeast Ohio at the county level, and that was our region. And that was also 1974-ish. Yep. And if you look at Chicago and you look at Cleveland, you know, circa 1970 and circa today, you wonder, is it the transportation system, which includes the very robust public transit system, that draws the distinctions of where we are today economically and otherwise? When you think about the amount of people that work and live in downtown or Chicago, or even just Chicago general versus Cleveland, and how the outward migration, which happened in both regions, it's not as if Chicago is an extremely dense as a region. They've got 6 counties, and there are people that live in all 6 counties and commute mostly to downtown Chicago. But you think of that pattern of outlying growth, which then was able to be served by public transit and then gather the interests of all of the counties and all of the communities together. Or you look at our system that essentially was able to serve each county individually, but didn't necessarily have a master plan for how all of it would grow together. And you look at the number of corporate headquarters we had in Cleveland in 1970, and you look at the number of corporate headquarters we have today, and it's a fraction. And you look at Chicago, and it's the opposite. They've grown. So again, you think about that and you say, it can work. So administratively, we've got example, it works. The other question then is, what would it look like, considering we have what we have here? In our long-range transportation plan, we listened to a lot of folks who said they want public transit. Actually, they said they wanted more of all modes, biking, pedestrian, and public transit, as well as automobile. They wanted choice. As Hunter said, that's what we need. I really appreciate the work that Derek did, speaking to public transit as a civil right. Again, thinking about how do we use public transit. It's not a social service. It's not there to get somebody out of poverty. It should be there to prevent someone from going into poverty. It should be there as part of the entire transportation system that is there for economic development reasons. Transportation system, the highway system, was developed as part of Commerce Act. And the Defense Act, so there's different reasons. But yeah, I think we can do it. If you look at our long-range transportation plan, we put an aspirational transit system in there. It serves 4 out of the 5 counties. One of the counties, Geauga County, told us they didn't want public transit, so we didn't plan for it there. It also only has 93,000 in population, so the density really isn't there to even think about a transit system at this time, whereas the other counties, even some of the ones that are perhaps not as dense as Cuyahoga, still have components or aspects of their counties that have that density and also have that job access need. So putting that together, we came up with a system. It's in there, it's aspirational, which means it's something that we heard people wanted. We don't have identified funding for it, but it's a conversation that needs to happen. It's a $14 billion plan. Take a look at it. Tell us what you think. And if the community has a consensus that we should move or advance that forward to a more serious dialogue, we'll do that.
All right. So one thing that you've mentioned, or one thing that you were saying, and I think just really kind of stood out to me, and probably stood out to everyone, is when you look at transit and think about where Cleveland could be potentially compared to Chicago, and that's something kind of crazy to think about because the cities are in such different places. And I mean, that's not to say that, you know, obviously that Cleveland would be the same, but I think that's really something to think about when, you know, in Cleveland we're big on talking about the future and success in the future, and to a certain group of people or to certain people that means a certain thing, and I don't think that transit's always brought into that conversation. I don't think that the least among us are always brought into that conversation. So I think that's a really interesting point that Grace made, and that we can think about as we look at future planning for Cleveland. One thing I wanted to talk about that you've all kind of touched upon is this whole debate of bringing jobs to people or bringing people to jobs. That's something that's a really big difference in development, and it kind of goes along with all of these regional kind of development plans. So who wants to take that one on?
I can touch on it.
Okay.
So and I think this all, at some point, all kind of starts tying in together. I would just follow up on Grace's point to say not only is Chicago a great example, but if we also look at the cities that are, if you think about the cities that are really on fire right now, in the last 20 years, 25 years ago, Charlotte was a crossroads, right? Not much going on there. Denver was a cow town, basically, with tumbleweeds pulling down Main Street or whatever the Main Street is there. Minneapolis is another great example. And I think sometimes, particularly in Ohio, we do have to remember where we're at, what the market is, and who we're speaking to, particularly with our electeds in Columbus. And so sometimes if we use the greatest examples, especially if you're talking about coastal cities, they can write you off. But if we look even at Midwestern cities, and sometimes the weather gets brought up as a factor, but when you look at Minneapolis and the investments that they've made in public transportation, and what that's doing in terms of driving the job growth, making the economic argument, and also with this kind of reverse migration that we're seeing of folks, both millennials and empty nesters going back to the city, capturing that. We just have seen in the last week or so with quotes out of Columbus, they can't quite figure out why the revenues aren't coming in as expected, right? We don't know why this is. We are the 7th most populous state and fund public transportation 43rd per capita. If you look at the states, the cities, and the regions that are really making moves, they are investing robustly in public transportation in all its forms and modes. We are not doing that here in Ohio, and I would submit to you and to those folks, if they were in the room, which I wish they were, that we have Republican-controlled states and electeds in other states and regions that are making these investments purely on the economic argument. And so let's take the politics out of it and look at it in this way. Why is Ohio lagging? Why are we still losing people? That's because if you have a choice of where to go as a young person today who doesn't care about your driver's license, we couldn't wait to get our licenses, right, Hunter, and drive to the mall back in the day. Young people today don't care about that. They want to be on their phones. They want to be connected, right? And so those are the investments that we need to make if we're going to be successful in attracting those folks. And oh, by the way, that's going to help everybody else, even those that can't afford a car, along the way. So all of this kind of ties in together. But I think at the end of the day, that's what you see in this economic argument. And in terms of the jobs, this also gets into land use planning. We have seen job sprawl as well as we have seen population sprawl. And quite frankly, it's much cheaper if you have a widget factory or something like that to plop it down on a cornfield someplace out in an exurb than it is to repurpose a brownfield site or a multi-story factory that aren't really used today. And so there is a much higher capital cost. So I think we need to look at, especially in our cities, what opportunities that we have, whether it be our port authorities, different organizations like that, or maybe some organizations that we haven't thought of yet, in terms of making our sites within the cities amenable to some of the manufacturing that is starting to reshore from China and elsewhere, and bringing these back to the city because we have these pools of workforce within the city, and that's not where the jobs are. So I think that's another part of the equation is, like you said, connecting people to the jobs, but also bringing jobs back into our urban cores, and how do we do that from an economic and a land use perspective to bring the jobs back to the people so you don't have to rely on a car.
Akshay, do you want to chime in on that?
So I think if you look at the economic state of where the average Clevelander is at, specifically those without a vehicle, there's no question right now that people still need access to the far-flung jobs, and you'll hear that from county's economic development folks. There's businesses starting in Westlake, there's businesses starting in Solon that just realistically, that's where people are going to go make the best wage possible, and they want to go get to that. They're not going to just sit on their hands and say, okay, well, I'll wait for the infill development to come. They're going for those jobs. The problem being that if they can't get there reliably and affordably, the boss isn't necessarily asking like, oh, how was your bus service today? They're saying, why are you 15 minutes late? And you're fired. So, the question isn't about you'll hear, oh, there's unreliable workforce. And it's like, yeah, because you've created an unreliable system to access that work. So people still desperately need to get to that employment, and I think that has to be dealt with in, we've talked a little bit about the kind of issues with funding, and that's going to have to be a priority. But to Derek's point of getting to where we are actually growing infill and getting jobs back in the core, you're seeing development still, even in Cleveland, where we have transit, that's where you're seeing the development. You're seeing it in University Circle, you're seeing it in downtown, you're seeing it around West 25th, you're seeing it around, the West 65th area is kind of in between a bunch of transit corridors, but that if there's transit, that's where there's actually activity right now growing in Cleveland. I would probably, I haven't been down as recently, but in Cincinnati, I feel like it would be, you could probably say it's much the same right now with Over the Rhine. And I think that that's so crucial. I was just in Seattle for work, and the amount of incredible intention and funding that folks have raised themselves to absorb new growth with public transportation is staggering, and there's a reason that people are going there. They're going there because public amenities exist, not because public amenities are being cut. That's not a very good selling point for your state or your cities. This has been brought up, but we're the 6th most urbanized state in the union, and we fund, in terms of raw state dollars, we fund public transportation less than Alaska, Iowa, and Vermont in terms of our state contributions. Not exactly urban powerhouses when you think about states out there. We are desperately trying to hurt ourselves in this race and giving away congressional districts in the next census. We're happily giving away growth to other states, and I think we really have to ask. We don't even have to look at Republicans in other states. We had Republicans right here, George Voinovich, who were willing to invest in public transit. Steve LaTourette, who understood the value of public transit. So I think we have to ask really deep questions about getting back to some of that legacy, why it's being disregarded, and why our communities are being disregarded in turn.
I think your comments raise a number of really important local issues about the efficacy of transit. And this is, it gets at the question, to bring people to the jobs to the people. Transit depends on density. Transit depends on a density of people and a density of jobs. Transit depends on the last link, which is how do you get to the bus stop? Where's the sidewalk? It is very difficult for RTA to service existing businesses in places like Twinsburg and Solon that are developed around an auto-oriented model. Probably the classic case of how we need to go through a generational paradigm shift, not just at the state level, but also at the local level, is Chagrin Highlands. Now, Chagrin Highlands, we tried when we first were doing the planning for Chagrin Highlands 25 years ago to get the Blue Line extension to happen in there and to use that as a structure for development. Ed Feehan, who was then congressman, got us an earmark back in the day when there were earmarks, and Dick Jacobs, who was the developer, killed it because he didn't want transit. That's sort of the first sin of commission. The second was the way in which it's been developed. So go to the center of Chagrin Highlands at Harvard and Richmond, and there's a hotel over there, and there are jobs in the shopping center over there, and there's a Panera, and then there's a hospital way over there beyond the retention basin, and way up on the hill with the best view in Cuyahoga County is Eaton Corporation. And I'm told by Joe Calabrese that the folks at Eaton said, "Oh, can you get us transit?" And they said, and Joe said, "You're way up a hill." The answer is no. The density is too low, the distances are too great. That's an urban. Well, there are parking lots in between, but there's also a very unpleasant walk if you could make it. So you've really got to design these things together. And one of the most interesting things we found, to get to the point of the businesses, is that site location analysts give you everything that you need to know about a site: the water, the sewer, the electrical, the rail line, how you're going to get the products in and out. They don't talk about how you're going to get the workers in and out. And funny thing happens, they don't get there. And funny thing in corporations like Eaton, which are competing globally for talent, that's not very attractive. It's not very attractive to be out in Solon today. It's certainly not very attractive to be out in Mentor today. I've been to businesses that lost their one really good IT guy because he didn't want to be out there in the middle of nowhere. It stands to reason that American Greetings, which was in sort of a middle of nowhere location, decided that they would go to an urbane place, even though it's, those of us who would argue that it's really not a real place, but it feels like a city. At least it's got density to support coffee shops. We're going through a generational paradigm shift. And Derek mentioned the importance of the highway system. The highway system decimated urban neighborhoods, not just neighborhoods of color, it decimated Tremont. It put the intersection right in the middle of an ethnic community and destroyed that community. It was even-handed in terms of destroying working class neighborhoods on both sides of the river. It led to job sprawl. the subsidy patterns of SBA, the subsidy patterns of EDA have all been to support job sprawl. It's very hard to reverse that, but that we need to be thinking about how to reverse that, not just at the state level, but also at the local level, to make it possible to get more jobs back closer to transit and to incentivize those jobs and to incentivize higher density housing. A lot of that's in local zoning. And a lot of it is going back and saying, well, we've got finished the first wave of Chagrin Highlands. The next wave of Chagrin Highlands, that frontage, that's the retention basin in front of the hospital, that's a development site. That frontage way down the hill from the castle on the top of the hill, that's a development site. That frontage that's a few outlots in the shopping center next to the hotel, that's a development site. You see this in Independence Road where sidewalks have been put in. So it's actually possible to get there by bus and actually possible to walk. But it's a whole paradigm shift about how we think about placemaking and bake transit into it and ask the question, how are people going to get there? And not to try to get RTA to service something that's unserviceable and leave people in the mud in the wintertime walking way up the hill, but work with those communities to say, if you want to be sustainable, you've got to design yourself, you've got to design for choice. Otherwise, you're not going to get the employees you want. Whether it's the production workers making a relatively modest salary that need to be there at 7 o'clock in the morning for the shift, or the highly skilled knowledge worker who you're trying to draw from San Francisco.
And Hunter, I think to the original question, do you get the jobs to people or the people to jobs? It's both, with the objective of integrating land use and transportation, so you are minimizing the time an individual has to spend in transit, whether it is in an automobile or on a bus or on a train, on a bicycle, walking. You're trying to minimize that time so the person has a better quality of life and is able to spend their time with their families, reading, shopping, doing whatever they want to do. And that often is lost. It's particularly lost in this region on some folks because we've never had a really bad commute.
Yeah.
Even with the sprawl, you can still get to places relatively in a short period of time. Even with the transit system, although it may not be as robust as some of the other larger cities, it's still better than a lot of cities, and you can still get to a lot of places on a bus. But how do you, are we really looking to service, create a train from point A to point B because the employers have moved all out here, even if there is enough density of employment centers? Well, do you want someone sitting on a train for an hour and a half? I don't think so. So, excuse me. So how do you better organize the land use and the transportation to minimize that travel time and increase the productive time? Even from an economic development perspective, you don't want your workers in transit. You want them being more productive and increasing the GDP for the region.
All right, one thing I just want to ask before I turn over to the audience questions is, a lot of this has been, how do we get people to care about this? How do we make transportation part of the conversation? And I mean, that's kind of what I want you guys to answer. How do we do this? Like, how do we move forward? How do we take this out of this room and make actual changes? What has to happen? What do we do? And how do we get to a situation where, somewhere as close as Akron is removing highways? I mean, that's not something that seems even possible in Cleveland. So what next?
I think there's two big things. I can tell you, our Cincinnati streetcar is a 3.6 mile, basically light rail loop from the Ohio River, what we call the banks, where the stadiums are located, through the central business district and into the over the Rhine neighborhood and back. We look at that as a first step because it's our first rail transit in Cincinnati since 1951. By the same token, our bus system is hanging on by a thread right now. We're one of the only systems in the country that has that is funded by city income taxes and not a county-wide sales tax. So we're not only are we not regionally funded, we're not even county funded. We're basically funding the entire system from the city itself. But I can tell you, in our decade-long battle just to build that 3.6-mile starter route, the best way that we could show people what they weren't used to or aware of or remembered from 1951 was by taking them to where a successful system was in place. And that started for us in the late 2000s using Portland as a model, and I think there are other better models now. Kansas City is a new streetcar system, Tucson, and I know from All Aboard Ohio's perspective, we continue to show and model what, for example, Michigan has done, and they're running multiple Amtrak trains a day at 110 miles an hour plus between Detroit and Chicago. Again, this isn't the crazy West Coast, this isn't Seattle or Portland, these are things going on right here in the Midwest. So my suggestion would be that we take people, take leaders, take civic leaders, to places that are not too dissimilar from Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, and Ohio, and show them what is going on elsewhere, because oftentimes we get caught up in our bubble that we have, and we go about our daily lives, even as elected officials, and we don't necessarily know what's going on elsewhere. So that is one thing. The other thing that I think that we have not historically done well in this state is work together between our urban centers. I can tell you, I can probably count on one hand or 0 fingers the number of times I've seen leaders from other cities in Cincinnati seeing what our best practices are, and vice versa. And that's part of the reason why I drive up here, why I was here in January talking about reopening Public Square, because we need to coordinate it and work together. Divide and conquer strategy, we're already divided and conquered. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, Cleveland's basically part of the Western Reserve and an industrial Northeast city. Cincinnati is basically a southern river town like St. Louis. And, you know, Columbus is a big Midwestern sprawl college town. And so we have a lot of dissimilarities through our state. But I think as urban centers, if we're going to move forward, we need to start to coordinate on these things. And I think over about the past 12 to 18 months with groups like Clevelanders for Public Transit reaching out to some of the Cincinnati advocates and our efforts on All Aboard Ohio and some others, certainly through the NAACP. I know there's not been coordination among the cities and the branches, that we could continue to do that and then marshal our forces together, show up in Columbus and say, hey, this is what's going on elsewhere, these are what the needs are, and we come together to put some pressure on the decision makers.
All right, thank you guys so much for answering my questions. Let's turn to the questions of everyone who came here tonight. So first off, we have a question about what role local administration has over public transit, and what change can really happen here locally without state support. Go ahead.
The city and its public works department is, I think there was a quote from New York that, Alex, if I butcher this, just signal at me, but that the city is the largest developer in town. It owns the streets, and it runs the streets, and it manages the streets, and it gets to decide how they're laid out, how they, and kind of what will be encouraged on as uses on those streets. We've touched a little bit on land use. It's not necessarily my forte, but I know there's a lot of positive steps that can be taken that are, like, I know in Cleveland still are taking a while. Form-based code, figuring out how to essentially encourage development around transit specifically is still a big challenge we have. We have a lot of, I don't know, the East 55th stop, what we're getting there is a new highway extension. So, you know, we're going in the opposite way of transit-oriented development in some cases. But then also when we're talking about just some of the real basics. I look at West 25th Street and Market District, and where you have rows of buses that are full, packed to the brim, that are deferred lane space to empty parked cars, who are often parking pretty cheap anyways, where there's free parking right behind the West Side Market. So the question really has to be about who are we dedicating space to? Why is a bus packed full of 40 people who've paid their fare, second highest fares in the country, for a city our size? Why are they being deferred for empty parking spaces? When we could be dedicating that space to bus lanes, when we could be like we still need to in Public Square. There's just a lot of ways that we could be. I mean, turning on signal prioritization at the city. We have that for the health line. It's not on all the time. It's kind of intermittent, and it seems like it's at the whims of the city engineer, and that's someone who is a local public employee. So when it comes to the things that can be done at the mayoral level, for example, they also appoint board members to RTA. They appoint board members to the local metropolitan planning organization. There's a lot that city officials really have authority over. The ability to actually go out and champion transit down in the State House, where right now, even with the meager amounts that we're putting in, the State House, we still are looking at 10% cuts to the general revenue contributions to Ohio Transit, and we're looking at as much as a $20 million loss from state policy that would result in 10% cuts, which I believe would make our transit system in Cleveland almost untenable. Having vocal champs out there is alone a big difference. It's obviously a giant fight, even if you do have a vocal mayoral leader. But, the question still has to be, are you speaking up, or are you just taking these cuts lying down? And, I think we're in an unfortunate position right now, and we need a lot more leadership.
I think it also goes to the suburban communities. It's not just the city of Cleveland, but it is a county-wide system that we're talking about in terms of the existing network. And there are opportunities in each one of the suburban communities that are served by RTA, particularly ones that RTA has identified for priority corridors, the strongest bus corridors, to organize their land use planning around that service, but more importantly, perhaps in terms of the politics of it, to organize their business community. South Euclid is a very interesting community because they have come to understand that their future depends on linking their first ring suburbs with the employment opportunities in University Circle, but also out at 271. It's progressive and the like. That's the market they want to market to. And you can go and look at each one of our suburbs and identify where are your people living and where are they working. A large number of people in Euclid, for instance, work in Euclid, but also a very large number work in University Circle. It is very difficult to get there, and the transit improvements that RTA studied make sense economically, but they're untenable now because there isn't the capital. That's a question that needs to be posed not just to the mayor of South Euclid or mayor of Euclid, but also to the employers in University Circle who spend millions and millions of dollars on parking garages and there's no more room. How are you going to open up your employment shed to the north and east if you don't do transit? If you don't get behind a transit system the way you got behind saving a baseball team and a football team. It's the same categorical imperative. If you look at why Charlotte is Charlotte and why Denver is Denver, it is not simply because the citizens wanted it, it's because the business community understood that it was a vital interest to them. I would suggest engaging the HR vice presidents in major corporations along corridors and say, how's it working for you? How you commute? How you recruiting when you don't have transit? Maybe we can figure out some ways to make things better, but that means you all going down to Columbus with us. The same way the business community in Cleveland went down to Columbus with the political actors and say, save our Indians, save our Browns, bring our Cavaliers back. Those are big public-private asks. And to think about this as a public-private partnership. But also, and this is some homework, go on the site and look at the priority corridors that RTA has, and look at the suburbs through which they go, and the city neighborhoods, and how do you link these, and where do they lead to, and who benefits in terms of being able to get to work, and who benefits in terms of having employees that can get to work, and are they at the table that you've set? Are we creating discussions about public-private partnerships along corridors that create constituencies that have some juice? That would be one of the things to think about. But it's not just a city issue. It's a very important city issue. But it's linking people in the cities to opportunities in the suburbs and vice versa. And if we can make that work, then other things are possible across county lines. But let's try to make Cuyahoga County, the city and the suburbs work. And if you, one of the things we did in Vibrant Neo is a region-wide land use analysis. And Grace's staff and I worked together to look at the transit corridors and the land use patterns. And I'm going to tell you, when you squint, because the way we did the housing tells you where you've got the densities to support regular transit. That's the Cleveland Heights, that's the Lakewoods, that's the Shakers, that's the Rocky Rivers. They can support regular transit in terms of the basic densities. And you squint and you say, Cleveland in the first suburbs, that's Portland. That is Portland. We just don't know it. We're laid out in Cleveland in the first suburbs in particular, but also out into the second suburbs to be transit friendly. We're just not acting in that way. But it's a lot easier to retrofit where you've got the density and the sidewalks and the front porches and the ability to do these things than it is to try to convert suburban cul-de-sacs to transit. So figure out some ways to work together across these lines, build constituencies that can and engage the business community, which is like, they're the ones that got to get the talent. And transit is not the only thing you need to have, but it's one of the critical factors in being able to get a reliable workforce. Engage folks in these discussions, but think about it in terms of corridors that connect people and jobs, people and opportunity, employers and prosperity, shared prosperity. How do we make this corridor work? How do we make South Euclid a prosperous place because people who work at the Cleveland Clinic and UH and Progressive want to live there? It's a really cool place to live. And by the way, you can get there by bus. You can drive. You've got choices. That's a different way of looking at our communities.
All right, thank you for that. That kind of leads into a question that someone in the audience asked, which I think you kind of already spoke to, but it's the issue of, why are we as taxpayers paying to bring people to these businesses for those jobs? Why aren't the businesses bringing them there themselves? So, I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that. You kind of already did, but yeah, how do we?
I think if you're talking about creating a transit or a transportation system that has some special service that goes to individual businesses, they should be paying for it. That's absolutely the case. But if you're building a transportation system that is inclusive and you're aligning that with the land use patterns, then it is part of the entire public space. It's part of the entire transportation system. So I think that's the distinction you have to draw. If in fact, and the RTA's done this probably in the 90s when there were some changes in workforce and when we started seeing some exodus to those far-flung counties or far-flung suburbs in Cuyahoga County, there were some employers that asked for special service because maybe the buses stopped here, didn't go all the way up the hill or whatever. We would map out what it would cost to take them up the hill, and we would charge them incrementally for that additional service. And certainly anyone could enjoy the service paying the fare, but it was then billed back to the industries, or there was some kind of a partnership maybe where it was 50% public funded and 50% funded by those organizations. And I think that's a good model.
If I could just add to that, I don't recall all the details on it, but I do remember reading an article in the last 30 to 60 days where in downtown Columbus, There's an effort to work with downtown employers to provide, because oftentimes employers will provide for parking or a stipend or $100 a month or whatever it may be for employees to park, particularly in the urban core. And there is a movement afoot there to work with the downtown office buildings and such to provide transit passes for their employees, which I think is great. They're looking at it from the perspective of this is going to reduce our parking demand and the pressure that is on the streets and the parking facilities if we can do that. So I think if we work together, as was mentioned, and think outside the box a little bit, there are opportunities, and I think it's not out of line to ask our corporate community to think beyond subsidizing parking and work with their employees to promote transit use.
So in the idea of thinking about things a little bit differently, you know, someone in the audience wants to know, what are some of, how do some of these newer technologies or newer things that are coming out, how do they play into this role in equity? So what role do you see things like Uber or Lyft or ride sharing or even, you know, autonomous vehicles playing into this idea of creating equity? Anyone?
I think to the extent that you see last mile connectivity being, or you know, something that a rideshare service can help with, or you know, for example, catching Amtrak here in Cleveland, you go about 2, 3 a.m. and transit's not running at that time, so that's a really helpful moment to have rideshare. I think the influence is often a little overstated, whether it's by the ODOT director talking about potentially driverless buses in the future without trying to fund them now, or you know, the issues of costs, because as soon as, for example, Uber Pool stopped being a subsidized service, its ridership has totally dropped out. So I mean, you know, the moral of the story is that you still have subsidized transit trips. That just is a need to make them work. And you know, if you actually get the growth that you want, I think the rideshare does not really help you plan for that. It just leads to congestion. In Chicago, I think rideshare has added 40,000 cars to the road because a lot of drivers, I mean, the companies are happy. They have a surplus of drivers available to pick people up from anywhere at any time. In terms of actually planning for that many additional cars on the road, you're not really helping out creating a better bus network. You're not helping create a better bike or walking safety. You're not really getting to creating a different type of land use or economic development that really can be a transit hub and accessible for a broader group of people. Rideshare, we work with a lot of folks with disabilities. Rideshare services will drive away when they see someone's service dog. If they're blind, they will not be wheelchair accessible very often. So you're talking about services that are just actually entirely inaccessible for people who rely on public transit most dearly. And so we really, there's a place for rideshare, certainly, and I think in terms of thinking even further forward, public car share is something that can actually really help deal with the amount of parking that you have and the amount of vehicles on the road. Most cars are parked about 95% of their life. So if you're able to have a public car share, I believe it's Bremen, Germany, they were able to take, for every car share that they brought on to service, they were able to eliminate 11 private autos off the road. So, you can really make these systems work, where that system, I believe, uses the same fare media as their bike share and the same fare media as their transit system. So all of a sudden you have integrated choices, and you've made so that cars are still available, but they're available at a rate that's actually reasonable, where you're not talking about having to store them all in your prime real estate area. So I think there's definitely promise for, being able to integrate this technology. I, for one, am just really happy that RTA is on real time. Whoop whoop. It's good to know when your bus is delayed. And so I think there's ways that we have to really think about how we're going to prioritize infrastructural technology, how we're going to have transit systems that can speak to signals and make sure that they're getting the priority that they need, and making sure that we have a grid that works for, again, public transit.
And I think where the technology is really going to benefit all of us is in the freight traffic. So I think the trucks in particular that are beginning to kind of experiment with the driverless systems, we'll start seeing more efficiencies. We'll start seeing them taking up maybe only one lane instead of three. What will that do? It'll reduce congestion. It will reduce air pollution. So I think on that side, that there's definitely benefit. And I do agree with our other panelists that we need to be concerned about equity in many, many forms. And as we think about the technology and what it's bringing to us in transportation, most likely the advances in transportation for the individual, if it's the driverless car or some other services, we just need to make sure that it is in fact affordable for everyone.
So I would also just like to add a point on that, especially from the perspective of the NAACP and this resolution with public transit being a civil right. We have seen across the country reports of, like you mentioned, rideshare or Uber-type Lyft drivers driving away for people with disabilities. Also, they tend to not want to go to particular neighborhoods. And then we also have the issue of the cost, particularly when you are, basically a slave to surge pricing. And we don't know how that's going to go in the future. I mean, Uber can pretty much decide to raise their rates whenever they want. And so I would be very skeptical and make sure that we don't get, I remember as a kid, and I'm dating myself, but, watching the Jetsons, and pretty soon we were all going to be going around on, in little spaceship cars, and 50 years later, we're still driving the same type of cars that we were previously, only with worse transit. So I would be very skeptical of this, particularly from the equity issue and making sure that we're serving all the people, that we do not put all of our eggs in the Uber basket.
Well, I guess I get upset by the pattern I've seen of people changing the topic when we talk about transit to talk about driverless vehicles. Well, the reality is driverless vehicles are some ways away. The technology is still unproven. And changeover of a fleet takes about 20, 25 years. It may be there for your grandchildren, maybe for your children. It may be there in certain big cities. It's not likely to be the dominant service for neighborhoods in a place like Cleveland anytime soon. We've got several decades, I think, to deal with the current reality. So don't be misled by, the newest thing, because the newest thing isn't so new. And Uber, the issue of surge pricing, there's a reason why taxis are licensed and there are regulations, because that's why cities did that, because taxi merchants in the old days, before licensing, before the rates were set, would gouge. Go down to the railroad station and pick, and you pay whatever we ask. That's not fair. It wasn't fair in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. It's not fair today. But I think staying focused on what do we have to deal with today and the next decade or so, how do we leverage the transit system we have, how do we support it, and when people say, well, we don't need this, we're going to do driverless vehicles. That's just a way for them to change the topic away from what are you talking about, how do I get to a job in Cleveland from Lakewood or Tremont or Huff? How do I get to a job in Mentor from Collinwood? How are you going to get me there today, tomorrow, and the next day? My grandkids can take care of themselves. I got to get to work now. Get the focus back on current reality and the fact that currently we are not competitive. Don't get waylaid by the icing. Stay focused on the cake.
All right, thanks. Just an editorial note there. I mean, we're saying that all of these technologies are taking away from transit in that conversation, but I mean, isn't taking the bus, the idea of ride sharing, or isn't that, you're not driving, you get hands-free, So.
Very critical is GPS predictability. And that you see that in more advanced systems uniformly, that you know exactly when the bus is going to be there. I mean, that gets at the market that is it's got to be there on time and will not tolerate lateness. There's no reason why that sort of technology investment in reliability, predictability, shouldn't be made today.
Well, I'll put a plug in for our GoHio commute program, in that we are using the latest technology to be able to have a database where individuals and companies can participate in identifying ways to ride share with each other, and that's something that 25, 30, 40 years ago was tried, and it was very difficult to move that forward. The technology is making it extremely easy for people to do that. Also, with the socialization of Uber, I think people have become much more comfortable getting into a car with a stranger, and so maybe ride sharing isn't as scary as it used to be.
All right, thank you. So we just have time for one more question. Sorry I didn't get to them all. Everyone has a lot of interesting things to say, though, and I appreciate you guys submitting them. So just to kind of end, I want to kind of just be a little reflective. So we have a question here asking, how does Northeast Ohio today compare to how it was, say, 20 years ago in terms of equity and transportation? Have we gotten worse? Have we gotten better? And what do we do next?
I think if you look at the numbers, we've gotten worse. I think we've sprawled, which has made it much more difficult for people to travel to whatever they need, whether it be jobs or whether it be doctors or schools, economic development, as well as quality of life reasons. And at the same time, our public transit system has been declining because of many reasons, one being, of course, funding. But I think at the same time, we need to be reflective about the sprawl, which has increased the footprint of our region by about 25%, makes transit less efficient. As we lose density, it's not as efficient either in service delivery or in the service economy. And so that's I think, a degradation of the service. The other aspect is we have about 25% more infrastructure to maintain than we did 25 or more years ago. So now we're looking at putting more money into additional infrastructure for essentially the same population or less than we had 25 years ago. So I think it's not a good picture at this point in time. That being said, I think there's a lot of energy around having realized some of the unfortunate externalities or the unintended consequences of some of the transportation decisions that were made decades ago, and the recognition that we need to think about how to change our planning processes to rectify that. Our long-range plan, if you look at just at the surface level, 90% of it is preserving the existing infrastructure, whether it be the transit system or the road network, highway system. It talks about adding some expansion, and that expansion, 10%, is not essentially what would have been thought of decades ago as true expansion. We're looking at enhancing the existing system. So I think we've learned we're not trying to expand, we're trying to keep what we have, and we're thinking bigger about integrating public transit bicycle and pedestrian access into the overall transportation network to make it more efficient. So I think maybe this is sort of a low point, but we're going back onto the better trajectory.
All right, thank you so much. Did you want to add something? Sure. Okay.
I would really agree with Grace's assessment, and I think I wasn't trying to bike in the streets when we moved here when I was 10. But I imagine, and someone else can correct me if I'm wrong, that at least on that front, we certainly have had some improvements, and I think with more grassroots work that we can continue to. 20 years was this really key part of the question for me, because in the last 20 years, Ohio has cut its public transportation contributions from the state by 84%. And I think that really needs to be put in relief against the pieces that Grace was talking about. We've added lots of new capacity and continue to do so at really high burdensome costs. The kind of numbers that you could be talking about expanding our public transportation system by 2, 3, 4 times, just in the amount of money that you're putting into, say, the Interbelt project. But you were also something that Hunter's Vibrant Neo process taught me was that we've been growing and we've been expanding and we have not gained population. For all the expansion, you would at least hope or presume that there'd be some gains or growth in population, that there'd be people coming in, and it's just very much not the case. Where we're gutting our center and we're expanding without actually gaining anybody to help pay for it. So you're talking about lots of new construction, new development that may be cheap now, but just in 10, 15, 20 years, you're talking about infrastructure that is going to need just as much maintenance as the stuff that's old, and with a population that's just not prepared to deal with it. So we're going to have a lot of reckoning to do, and I am hopeful that this is the kind of crew here in this room, in this crowd. And I also appreciate the League of Women Voters for, I believe they passed a resolution on getting public transportation funding at the state level, and we're going to need a lot of partners to be able to really turn this to something that I think, like Grace is saying, that we can measure our progress from, because it's there for the taking.
So we're out of time now. I'm just going to wrap up. But throughout this conversation tonight, we've had a lot of our speakers here have talked about how we have officials working to fix this in the ways that they can. And there's a lot of you here in this room. You're all involved in grassroots kind of way, trying to change things. So, I would just leave in saying, keep this conversation going. We have a lot of kind of rallying cries that came out of tonight. I'm a reporter, so I wrote down quotes while everyone's speaking, and it's just a few things stand out. Like, think of transportation as a civil right. Make this the next public square. Bring this to the forefront, and make people listen. So. That's all I'll say today, but thank you guys for coming out. Thanks for caring, and thanks for spending your time with us here tonight.